And we're going to start with Annie. Annie Bracey is an avian ecologist at NRRI in Duluth and a recent graduate from the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology at the University of Minnesota, where she received a PhD studying common tern ecology. Annie's interested in studying the impacts of human activities on bird populations and integrating ecology, biology, and conservation sciences to better inform management decisions associated with avian populations. Much of Annie's research is focused on conservation and management of wetland birds and water birds breeding in the Great Lakes region. Annie.
Thank you so much. Can you guys hear me okay? Awesome. Well, yeah, I'm excited that everyone got to get some donuts and get reinvigorated for the next two talks. I'm going to be basically just talking about a project that we started in our lab about a year and a half ago to look at the distribution of black terns and common terns in Minnesota. So I'm just going to talk about what the objectives of that project are and some of the methods we're using. Last summer was our first field season of data collection, so I don't have a ton of results, but I'll just kind of talk through what our goals are. So just some really basic background for both black and Forster's terns. They are wetland species. They prefer, obviously they can be found in lots of different locations, but prefer extensive wetland, emergent vegetation and open water, and large wetland complexes where available. So of course some of these species core areas are like in the prairie potholes, for black terns especially. For nesting, black terns are considered a semi-colonial nesting species, which is one of the things that makes them frustrating to study. So they will move, so that means they can nest in large colonies or in really loose small colonies with a few other nesting pairs of birds. And they are more impacted by changes in vegetation between years, whether or not they'll come back if a site is still adequate for them to nest. So they prefer, again, emergent vegetation or floating mats of vegetation and debris. And I should just say too, because it's important, but Steve Colby did almost all of the surveys for this project, and he took all of the pictures, which is makes this presentation much more interesting to look at these beautiful pictures. So thanks, Steve. Forster's terns also tend to nest in similar locations with black terns. They have some differences in habitat preferences, of course, larger open water for foraging for fish, and they also tend to nest on floating mats of vegetation, the base of cattails and muskrat houses, old muskrat houses. So basically, there have been a lot of efforts by, just birders or organizations like the DNR to collect information on these species over the years, and so we relied heavily on that for the basis of doing our site selection for this study. And if you go to the Minnesota Breeding Bird Atlas website, all of the species have really nice background information about the history of their breeding in the state, and so that's where we took a lot of this information as well, from historical records to current day records. But basically, the statewide distribution for both species has remained relatively the same over the last 100 years. But what has happened is that the abundance of the species has been significantly declining in recent decades. This is just maps from eBird, that they have their trend maps available now, which are really a useful tool to look at. But you can see that, of course, for both species, the abundance has been declining in Minnesota. Because of this, these species are listed as greatest conservation need by Minnesota DNR, or target conservation species by Audubon. And some of the reasons that their abundance is believed to be declining are changes in habitat availability and condition as well. So we wanted to look at habitat features that were associated with long-term occupancy of nesting sites throughout the state, and then also compare that to sites where one or both of these species had historically nested, either consistently or in large numbers, and that are not currently found. And to use that information to try to see if there is something underlying that with the habitat that could be valuable for informing restoration or conserving really high quality sites. Some of our other objectives were to determine the best way to try to monitor these species long term in the state, because of course they can be challenging based on where they're nesting to access them easily for regular monitoring. So that was one of the goals of this project as well. And we wanted to look at food availability to see if there were any differences in food availability between sites that are persistent versus those that are currently abandoned. And of course, there are a lot of other people studying black terns throughout their breeding range, and so we also wanted to try to collect data in a way that could easily collaborate with others that are collecting similar data across the range. So what we did, we integrated the data that was available to look again at historical and current occupancy. Of course, those terms are really vague, what that means if a site is historically active or not. And so what we did was we kind of used the Minnesota Breeding Bird Atlas, which occurred in 2012, as the current breeding, and anything prior to that would be considered historical. Excuse me. And so, yeah, again, luckily the DNR has collected a lot of data on these species over the years. A lot of the historical data had been archived in there, so we used that as well as the data from the Minnesota Breeding Bird Atlas, which was also useful, and of course eBird data to fill in any gaps as well. And so from that, we selected a subset of wetlands that we wanted to prioritize for doing more intensive surveys. So this is just an example of a made-up site where there are no black or Forster's terns. Imagine that. But basically what we were hoping to do and collect at each of the sites. So at a given wetland, again, once it was determined that it was occupied by one or both species, to kind of document any landscape scale changes, looking at water control mechanisms, since we know they're really influenced by fluctuating water levels, look at basic land cover change that's occurred, and also invasive species plants, invasive species, and other things like that that we can just get from readily available data sets. And then for local scale data, we'd go to the site, and the information we'd collect there would be point count and flush counts of the target species. If possible, we'd verify nesting activity. Of course, if we find a nest, then we would mark that location, but also, of course, we could interpret breeding based on behavior, even if a nest wasn't found. And we also wanted to conduct drone surveys to try to get some high resolution imagery of these sites to see if we could differentiate any structural differences in the habitat and use. We collected water quality data and then some food stuff that I'll talk about as well, and then just some basic vegetation surveys. So last summer, we visited 33 sites, again, where we did point counts from land and then flush surveys in a kayak if possible. At 9 of those 33 sites, we also collected more in-depth information So this is just an example of Thief Lake was one of our focal sites. At that site, we also deployed water level loggers so we could monitor changing water levels constantly and temperature as well throughout the breeding season. And then to get an index of food availability, we put out aquatic insect traps, did some ponar sampling for hexagena, and then dip nets at sites, and then for Forster's terns, we did cast net and seining. So here's just some photos of the things that we deployed at each of the sites. In the upper left-hand corner, you can see Steve is kayaking out some emergent insect traps that we put at the plots, and then just some seining. So in the first year, I should go back for a minute, but without going into too much detail about the site selection, we did try to get a pretty good sample across the state. So we did north, central, and south kind of areas, and then tried to do confirmed nesting locations, so current nesting, and then historical sites. And then the possible is where birds have been seen often during the breeding season, but there was just no evidence documented of breeding. And so those were kind of our categories of sites to visit. And so, again, it should be noted that at these sites, we're not trying to survey every bird that was there, because it's already really field intensive to even get out there and see birds and do this. So we picked a site, a location at the site, and then did the estimate there as kind of an index for breeding activity. So we detected 265 black terns at 17 of the 33 sites. There were no birds detected at 5 sites that had previously had confirmed nesting activity, and 2 historically active sites where we did confirm breeding. But of course, when they got there, they kind of determined the birds had always been breeding there, likely, and just nobody had been there to say so. Forster's terns, similar, we had detected 182 birds at 17 of 33 sites. 0 birds were detected at 2 sites that had previously confirmed nesting activity, and 5 historically active sites were confirmed to be active. And again, similarly, some of those sites, it appeared that those birds had probably been nesting there for a while. So this map is just kind of laying out where we had no detections of either species, which sites, and it might be really hard to see, so. But basically, it's kind of just what I talked about, but which sites had both species present, and the highest number of birds that were documented at which wetlands those occurred at. So you can see there are some similarities. Wetlands that hosted a large number of black terns often had a relatively large number of Forster's terns as well. And so going back here too, you can see that, some of the sites had, 1 or 2 birds in them. And so differentiating those more ephemeral sites where there might be a few birds nesting to the larger ones that are, have a lot more species that are probably more persistent, just trying to figure out where those are to recommend those for future long-term monitoring versus going to sites that might phase in and out between years. So assessing food availability, of course, again, this is like a big job to try to do when we know we can really only get an index of what's happening at these sites at best. And based on their foraging range, we know that black terns, recently they've been doing some transmitter work and have found out that they forage incredibly large distances, much larger than had been thought. So, knowing that, it is still really site dependent. So if there's a wetland that's surrounded by ag and maybe not a lot of wetlands around it, those birds are probably keying in what is happening at that wetland versus if you have more options to feed. But what we did is we made the assumption that the wetland that they were choosing to breed at was some index of the quality or availability of food that they were accessing for themselves and young. So yeah, just some pictures of what that looked like. So the effort to collect information, and again, because it was so intensive, we just wanted to do it at a subset of the sites just to get the methods down, see how easy it was, and then hopefully after 2 years, even if our sample size is still relatively low, that there may be something interesting or something really obvious about differences between these sites that we could hone in on and then make as a proposal for a future study. So a couple of the challenges that we had, Minnesota is what it is. And so the birds were, for both species, were initiated breeding later than we had expected, and we didn't really obviously expect that, so we had to stop our surveys for 2 weeks and restart, so it kind of shifted our whole field season. And then, of course, it was a really wet, cold, late spring. Water levels were really high, so even at sites that shouldn't have been as difficult to access, they were. And then those water levels in some places became extremely low in mid to late July when people went back to get the emergent traps, some of which were just sitting on top of mud. So it was a little bit tricky, but we definitely learned some things about that, and we'll be doing the same, proposing to do the same thing this year. And then the last thing I just wanted to mention briefly, because it is related to this project as well, is that there has been a large range-wide effort to put geolocators and other tracking devices on black terns across their breeding range to try to get a better sense of where they're migrating and overwintering. And so we put 10 geolocators out on black terns at the Agassiz National Wildlife Refuge this summer. Of course, these tags are archival, so we will have zero data until we go back and retrap the birds and get the tags off. So that's what we're planning to do this summer. And if we're successful, then we will deploy some additional tags this year as well. And that's always really nice to be able to be part of a bigger study so that the results are obviously more relevant and have better context when it's range-wide. So our plans for next year are to survey up to 36 new sites using the same methodology and then collecting the high-resolution imagery with a drone. We were unable to do that this year because the camera came 2 months after the breeding season. So we'll have double duty on that this year. And then again, yes, going to retrieve geolocators. I just wanted to thank, first of all my lab mates and everyone who actually collected the data and went and did all the hard work. The Environment Natural Resources Trust Fund funded this project, so that's through the LCCMR, so we're really grateful for that funding. And then all the people who gave us access, a lot of the sites were on National Wildlife Refuges or WMAs, which of course have some access issues. So everyone was extremely helpful. That's it.
Excellent. Thank you, Annie. We're going to come around for another round of questions, everybody. Again, a reminder, mention your name, maybe affiliation, and if you could stand or at least give a wave so we can see where the speaker's coming from, that would be helpful too. Thanks so much.
I just have a quick question about the food resources of black terns. I don't know if I missed it, but is it similar to foresters or to foresters' terns with small fish being the foods? And I guess that extends to, are there invasive species potentially? Aquatic invasive species that might affect them, or fisheries management practices that might affect them?
Sure. Good questions. So the Forster's terns primarily feed on fish, so small prey fish, shiners, perch, things like that I don't know much about, but small fish like that. And then the black terns are mainly eating aerial insects, so aquatic emergent insects that like dragonflies or mayflies, but they will eat a variety of things as well. So you can see some of these pictures that Steve took these. One of them is carrying a frog. They will eat fish as well, but they primarily focus on insects.
I have a question regarding, my name is Andrea Lambrecht. I have a question regarding the number of muskrat houses. I seem to think that there, from just my observation, just casually, that there aren't as many muskrat houses. So what percentage of the black terns do you think are using muskrat houses?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I know that people are looking at that a lot more, even just in terms of muskrats really changing the structure of wetland habitats, especially really dense cattail habitats. There are a lot of species, I think, that rely on them. They're kind of like beavers in that way, kind of like ecosystem engineers. They change that, and of course, people have talked about muskrats declining. I can't speak to that specifically, nor to how many birds or how many of them are reliant on those. So I don't have a good answer for you, but that is a good and important question.
Can I ask a second question?
Sure.
I was just wondering what the distance is for the foraging for the black tern from their nesting area?
Yeah, I can't remember exactly what their estimated foraging range was, like in the Birds of North America account. But I mean, several kilometers at least. But when they put satellite transmitters on birds during the breeding season, they were moving up to 15 or 20 kilometers foraging. So obviously that's really extensive. And part of that probably, again, has to do with access to other resources. So just as an aside, like some of the sites on the periphery of the range, like in Maine, where there's very little habitat available, those birds have been much easier to study and to get geolocators from, because if they come back, there's only a very small place for them to nest, and probably forage as well. But then, in Saskatchewan, where they put out a lot of geolocators, I think they put out 50 and they got 3 back. So those birds come back and there's just a lot more available habitat for them to choose for nesting. So they're more challenging to study in that way, and maybe thinking about where you could study their foraging. I mean, I think it would be really cool just to do that. Having radio transmitters or satellite tags, and that's what they're doing in Saskatchewan, to really try to hone in on how much space they're using and during the breeding season. But it's much larger than was expected.
George Skinner. So these birds are sharing habitat with waterfowl, so I'm wondering if there's any indication of a population decline or mortality due to avian influenza.
That's a good question too, and I don't know if there, maybe Kristen Hall or somebody, I should throw somebody else to know it, the answer, or Francie, like what the influences. Obviously there were big influences on Caspian tern populations and some common terns as well, which are more tight colonial nesting birds that nest with other waterfowl more closely. So I don't really know. I haven't heard anything about black terns or Forster's terns being impacted by that, but maybe somebody else here knows that. Somebody does? Okay, yeah. Oh. Uh-oh.
Crystal Lake, which is maybe 5 miles from here. Black terns were incredibly common, and they were one of the first, non-robin birds that I learned to identify. So anyway, I don't know why they were there, but they were there in quite large numbers.
All right. I'm going to use my microphone privileges to ask a question. Were you working on Forster's terns with those transmitters too, or just black terns getting the solar transmitters?
We haven't put any transmitters on Forster's terns, and there's seems to be more of a focus on black terns, but Steve has decided that Forster's terns are where it's at, so we'll probably have to dedicate some more time towards that. But I do think they are, obviously there have been a lot of studies on both species in the state, and the DNR has a great wealth of knowledge about that too. But yeah, just trying to figure out next steps for what's going on with those. Of course, there are way fewer Forster's terns colonies, but they do seem to be pretty persistent. So,
Thanks so much, Amy.
thanks.